Welcome to episode 225 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to share some thoughts on how to approach solving overwhelming problems in school. Solve for all kids by starting with one kid. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, or find our Truth for Teachers podcast community on Facebook. A big thanks to Advancement Courses for sponsoring today's show. For over 30 years, Advancement Courses has been a leader in professional development, providing expertly crafted courses to thousands of teachers across the country. And in recognition of the Teacher Appreciation Week, Advancement Courses is celebrating educators like you with a giveaway. Nominate an outstanding teacher by April 30th, and they could win a $100 Amazon gift card. Visit advancementcourses.com/teacher-awards to learn more and celebrate all the amazing teachers who go above and beyond. That's advancementcourses.com/teacher-awards. Teachers, if you're looking for new ways to elevate your classroom and accelerate learning, then listen up. Check out RISE Math and ELA program bundles from McGraw-Hill at mheonline.com/RISE1. These programs for grades 3 to 8 identify learning gaps and create a unique learning sequence and pace for each child. Covering over 1,000 key grade level learning objectives in math and ELA, teachers get real-time feedback and progress. Plus, kids can access RISE offline too through the app. For just $30 a year, you or your school can purchase a subscription for 5 students, making it perfect for intervention and support for kids who are struggling. Just go to mheonline.com/RISE1 to learn more about all the different packages available and how RISE can help your students. That's MHE for McGraw-Hill Education, online.com/RISE1 for the RISE Math and ELA program bundles from McGraw-Hill. We're talking in this episode about how to solve big, overwhelming problems that we're facing in our schools and classrooms. And what I'm going to share is a simple, straightforward approach. To solve for all kids, start with one kid. Maybe you can't make every lesson topic relatable and engaging for every kid, but you can start with ways to engage one kid. Maybe you can't fix all the home barriers for learning for every kid, but you can start by finding solutions for one kid. Now, this doesn't mean that we pick and choose which kids to help or that we leave some kids out. Instead, this is a way to break down a problem that feels so impossibly big that you can't fix it, something huge like student engagement, and look for solutions that work for individuals. Because if you can solve for one person, that means it is at least partially a solvable problem. And that means you can solve it for the next student and the next. In a moment, I'm going to share a step-by-step method for doing this, but I think it will make a lot more sense to you if we talk about the context of this approach first. Back in episode 197, I interviewed Dan Heath about his book Upstream. That episode was called Creating Systemic Change and Solving Problems Before They Happen. If you missed episode 197, that would be a great one to download next, because Dan shares some really fascinating examples of how systemic changes are made. And it kind of leads us into how solving for one kid can help solve for all kids. I'm going to play an excerpt here in which Dan gives an in-depth example about a problem in a school.
So the story I'm talking about happens at Chicago Public Schools, CPS, one of the largest school districts in the country, 300,000 plus students, a $6 billion budget, which is about the same as the whole city of Seattle. This is a big battleship we're talking about. And back in 1998 era, the graduation rate at CPS was 52%. I mean, you had a coin flip's chance of graduating as a teenager in CPS. And so imagine, to your question, imagine you're a concerned teacher or administrator inside that system and you just find it unbearable, intolerable that the failure rate is that high. What do you do? Well, let me describe what happened at CPS. The first ray of hope that things could be different came when some academics, including a woman named Elaine Allensworth, who's become really well known for this work, she discovered that in the freshman year, they could predict with 80% accuracy which of those freshmen would go on to graduate and which would drop out. I mean, freshman year, 4 years ahead, 80% accuracy. They called this metric freshman on track. And there were two very simple components of it. One was, did the freshman complete 5 full-year course credits? And did they not fail more than one core course? So if you failed a core course like English or math, and if you failed just one, you could still be on track. 2 was the critical threshold. And those two things together compiled this freshman on track metric that was very predictive. So in a nutshell, what they found was there's something peculiar about the 9th grade year, this kind of transition point into high school, that is critical for getting students to graduate. All right, so that's part 1 of the story. Part 2 is, what do you do with that information? So you know a freshman is off track. What now? And that's where they had to invent new ways of collaborating together. So the first thing that they observed was some of their own policies were sabotaging their students unwittingly. So one example was the late 90s and the early aughts were the tough on discipline era, zero tolerance. And I talked to one person who was active in this work, and she said, in those days, 2-week suspensions were doled out like candy. You know, a couple of kids would shove each other in the hallway, and boom, both of them were out with a 2-week suspension. Well, what we now know from the research is, if you take an at-risk kid and you kick him out of school for 2 weeks, guess what happens? They never catch up.
Right.
They come back, they're lost, they fail the class, they fail a couple of classes, and boom, they're off track. So do you think any of those assistant principals knew when they were doling out these suspensions that they might well be dooming them to drop out of high school? Certainly not. But you've got to look at systems carefully when you're going to change them. The most profound thing that they did by way of changing students' trajectories from off track to on track, they adopted this practice called freshman success teams, where all the 9th grade faculty, biology, English, math, arts, and so forth, they would get together, a couple times a month. And the subject was specific students. They would get a list from the district of students who were most likely to be off track based on their current grades, based on their attendance. And they would go name by name. They would say, okay, Michael, was he in school every day last week? Okay. How are his math grades doing? Last time they were suffering. Well, we got him some extra tutoring, so now he's at a C. Okay, great. Let's talk about Keisha. Well, Keisha's having this issue where she has to drop off her little sister at elementary school every morning, so she ends up coming to first period late almost every day. Oh gosh, we're not going to be able to fix that. So what if we switch her into PE first period? So at least if she suffers in first period, it's for a class that's an elective rather than a core course. And that was the way change was made. It was made one name at a time. And school by school, meeting by meeting, student by student, these numbers started to budge. They started getting students to show up at school more. They started figuring out ways to boost grades, to give more support. And the freshman on-track numbers began to improve. And then just as those numbers had predicted, 4 years later, when it was time for those kids to graduate, they started graduating in higher and higher numbers, to the point where last year or the year prior, the number was up to 78% graduation.
Wow.
I mean, more than a 25-point increase in the graduation rate in one of the biggest school districts in the country. And I think anybody listening to this who's been involved in education can appreciate just the sheer magnitude and improbability of that story. I mean, this is one of those situations where most people just assume a posture of learned helplessness. It's too big of a problem. The district is too big. There's no way we can ever pull enough levers to move this. They moved it.
Now, there's a lot more to that conversation in episode 197. Dan talks about how grade level teams work together, so teachers had more information about their students than what they could uncover on their own. And he talks about how data meetings were used in ways that were actually helpful instead of just feeling punitive to teachers, how data was actually used in a way that helped teachers make decisions that were useful for individual students. So do check out that whole episode for more. But he and I had that conversation a year ago. And it's resurfaced in my thoughts so many times since then, given the number of problems that it now seems that we have to solve and the overwhelming complexity of them. And I think we have to choose to see big problems as solvable, as things that we can do something about. Because if the problem is truly that massive, we can't just do nothing. What Dan's book Upstream showed me is how often the solution to big problems is solving smaller ones. And one approach for solving might be this idea that I've been experimenting with, which is to solve for all kids, start with one kid. Now, I'm working off the assumption here that your school already has elaborate methods for data collection and tracking interventions and so on. But I want to share a really simple approach. Think of it as classroom-based action research, something that's just for you. You can experiment with this anytime there's a problem you need to solve that seems to be impacting a lot of kids. Use it when you're overwhelmed with the scope of the problem and you don't know where to start. The first step is to frame the problem as a question that digs for the root issues. Instead of saying, for example, hardly any of my students are turning in their assignments, ask yourself, which students aren't turning in their assignments and why? This first step is about getting curious and preparing yourself to look beneath the surface to something different. Then identify which kids are impacted. If you teach multiple class periods, just take one group of kids that you work with and make a 3-column list. Those who generally turn in work on time, those who are hit or miss, and those for whom this is a major issue. Once you see that list there in black and white, you may be surprised to learn that a smaller percentage of kids have a major issue than what you'd assumed. And this step alone can be really powerful. It can show you how you're framing the problem as bigger than what it actually is, and that's what's making it feel so impossible. We can't come up with workable solutions until we understand the true scope of the problem, not just how big the problem feels. It feels like hardly anyone in class turns in their work on time. But noting which kids are turning in most work, and which ones are turning in some, and which ones are totally off track is important. Then jot down any information you have about why those kids are impacted. Look at the column of kids who were struggling the most in this area. Chances are good that the reasons they're not turning in work are different from student to student. Write down any information you have about why the work isn't getting turned in. Do they have an after-school job? Are they responsible for sibling care? Have they recently moved? Are they being shuffled between multiple homes for custody purposes? Do they struggle with reading or writing so basic assignments are just too hard? Spend a moment thinking about each student in that most severely impacted column, that 3rd column, and what you know about the reasons why. Then you're going to underline the reasons that you know for sure are true. Through this process, you might find that you don't actually know much about what's happening with a particular student. It might suddenly become obvious that you really haven't tried much yet to get to the bottom of the problem. And that's okay. It just means that there may be some fairly simple solutions that you can try. It might also become evident that you've made some assumptions, but you haven't actually checked in with a particular student recently to find out what's going on. For example, you might be vaguely aware that a student's parents separated a few months ago, but you're not really sure if they got back together, they got divorced, or how any of that is actually impacting the student. That student might be feeling absolutely fine about the separation, and now they're worried about an unrequited crush. If you don't know for sure, put a question mark by it if you want to, but only underline the reasons that you're certain are truly impacting the student's work completion rate, or whatever problem it is that you're solving for. The next step is to make notes for yourself about things you can do to learn more. You might set up a reminder to talk with a student before or after school, contact the family, follow up with a school counselor, or check in with the student's other teachers to see how the child's doing in their class. It could be helpful to approach this like a detective solving a mystery, like the case of a student who doesn't turn in any work. Now, you can disregard that analogy if it doesn't sit quite right with you, but I personally think it's much more intriguing and motivating to solve a mystery than it is to follow up for the 1,000th time with a kid who's not doing their work. Solving a mystery implies being curious rather than judgmental. It involves looking for clues and patterns. What might you be able to do to learn more about what's happening with the student? Once you've identified some things that you could do, look for the low-hanging fruit. Start with the problems that are easiest to solve. Now, during this process, you might find yourself getting overwhelmed by how many problems there are and how many things that you feel like you need to do for follow-up. But here's the thing. You're not going to try to solve all the problems all at once. You're just looking at the scope of what needs to be addressed. To solve for all kids, you're going to start by solving for one kid. Often it's good to start with low-hanging fruit first. In other words, begin with the easiest problems to solve and use that forward progress to build momentum. Maybe there's a student who was doing much better with turning in work when you gave a hyperdoc organizer for the week, but you stopped doing that for a while for various reasons that you can't remember. Reintroducing the hyperdoc might solve the problem for that one kid. You know how to do that, and you know it helps, so that's an easy, actionable step. Maybe there's a student who just lost a loved one and isn't coping well with the grief. In terms of your responsibilities for supporting that student and turning in work, this is fairly low-hanging fruit as well because the root problem doesn't have anything to do with you or your class or the way your assignments are structured. You can schedule a check-in with that student and make sure they're included in relationship and rapport-building elements of your day. And there may be other supports and resources within your school that you can offer for trauma. But this is a student who needs time and space to process grief. And giving more after-school tutoring or other academic supports that another child may benefit from are probably not going to be the most effective solution for this child, at least at first. Now, these are sweeping generalizations I'm making here about a hypothetical child. So don't take it the wrong way. If you have a child who's grieving in your classroom, I'm not saying you don't need to do anything. I hope you get my point. Start with the low-hanging fruit. Look for the simplest steps that you can take. Some things are out of your control. That might not be the piece you want to start with. Start with the things you can do. That way you don't get discouraged and feel like the problem's just too big for you to even try. So it's fine to begin with the problems that seem easier to solve and work from there. The result is that you will begin to uncover patterns, which means you can look for scalable solutions. If you notice that several kids could use more frequent individual check-ins, for example, you can create a schedule for that. So each morning you check your list and you notice which students you need to initiate an additional conversation with. Or maybe you notice that several kids claim their work isn't getting turned in because they forgot how to submit assignments through the new online portal. You can make a note to yourself to resend the screencast with instructions to those kids and walk them through it again the next time an assignment is turned in so they have that additional level of accountability. Now, this kind of thing is never fun to do as a teacher. Can we just admit that? Repeating directions over and over again is frustrating. But it's easier to offer that support when you know exactly which students to target and you're watching them carefully to ensure that that reason isn't used as an excuse the next time around. As you look for patterns and you notice overlapping problems and accommodations, it should begin to feel like you're seeing some kind of organization arise from chaos. A huge, overwhelming problem like kids not turning in their work becomes about solving that problem for just one kid, and then another, and then another. It's much easier to think of solutions and interventions for one student, as in what could help this child, versus how do I get all my students to turn in their work consistently? The reasons that they're having a problem are individual, so the solutions are individual, with common patterns and themes so you can pull from a toolbox of supports as needed. That's how you create systems and structures that are individualized. The final step is to check in regularly to see which kids you're prioritizing and look for bias or inequity. As you go through this process, you want to check in with yourself and make sure you're approaching your problem solving systematically. Watch to make sure you're not leaving kids out or prioritizing certain types of kids over others. You want to check in with yourself and ask, am I solving more for girls or am I favoring boys? What about students with disabilities? Am I avoiding their problems because they feel too hard? Or am I ignoring the kids who don't qualify for special services but are still really struggling? How about race and ethnicity? Is there a group underrepresented here in my problem solving? Or maybe there's a group that's overrepresented. Maybe there's a personality thing. Am I focusing more on kids that are like me or relatable to me? It's very common for us as educators to identify with some kids more than other kids. And noticing that natural human tendency can help us reach out more to the kids that we find it harder to connect with. If you notice that you're giving a higher priority to certain types of kids than others or certain groups of them, or maybe you're viewing a behavior as a major issue when one gender or one race exhibits it, but you're shrugging it off when another does it, that's a sign of bias. Being aware of that bias can help you watch out for it and ensure that you're treating students equitably. So this 8-step approach is a general overview of one way that you can tackle big problems. Start by looking how to solve for one kid. Solve for individuals first and notice patterns in what people need so that you can scale it a bit. There's something powerful about knowing that even if you can't solve every problem for every student, you can help solve this thing for that kid. And that's the way progress is made. This is your takeaway truth for the week ahead. We create better systems by designing those systems for individuals, rather than trying to force individuals to fit into the systems. So when everything starts to feel overwhelming and you're frustrated because you can't fix everything for everybody, come back to fixing it for one kid and go from there. You can't do everything that all of your students need, but you can help solve this problem for that kid. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it.